What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we have got another episode of Battlefront 2 Mythbusters, this time focusing on which blasters have the fastest and slowest blaster bolt speed. Now, when I talk about the blaster bolt speed, I don't mean the rate of fire or anything like that, but I actually mean the velocity of the blaster bolt, so essentially how fast it travels through the air once you have fired the weapon. And the reason for testing this is because I wanted to know how much you actually need to lead your shots with each blaster. Now, before we jump into the actual test, I do need to just quickly explain how I tested all of this. So what you can see on screen now is essentially just how I edit the videos. So there's a red track down the bottom, which is the audio, the blue track in the middle, which is the video, and the yellow one at the top, which is the timer overlay. You can see this little cut in the yellow bar here. That cut is exactly where the timer starts, and then as you can see, it is lined up exactly with the little movement on the red bar down the bottom, which is the audio. So as soon as the blaster shoots, that red bar makes little waves in the audio, and that is where I've started the timer on each shot. The second cut is then where the timer ends, and on each shot that is lined up with the first frame where the enemy gets hit. So the timer starts by looking for movement in the audio, and then the timer ends by looking for damage on the bottom of the split screen footage rather than judging by the sound, since the hit marker noise can be a little deceiving. Now, I do also just need to quickly say that the differences between these tests is barely anything at all. It's within about 1 or 2 frames for most weapons, which is 1/60th of a second. So it might not seem like much, but what you can see on screen now is actually one single frame of movement from Luke sprinting in the distance. And you can see right there that one frame does actually make a decent amount of difference at this range, especially when you consider trying to hit a moving target. So the differences don't seem like much at all, and it might seem a little bit like a pointless test, but just keep in mind that if you're shooting at a moving target, especially at long range, that single frame can actually make a world of difference. So with all of that rambling out of the way, we are going to jump into the tests and see which blasters have the fastest or slowest bolt velocity. To make sure the distances were always the same, I lined Luke up with this little hole on top of the Falcon, and then each test I lined the Trooper up with this tree in exactly the same spot. So the first test is of course the base weapon for the Assault class, and this came in with a timer of 17 frames, so just over a quarter of a second. Next up we had the A280, and this was without mods, as there is actually an improved range mod that I wanted to test, and this came in just slightly faster at 16 frames. I then tried the A280 again, but with the improved range mod to see if it does make a difference, but as you can see, all it changes is the damage at range rather than the actual velocity of the bolt. Next up was the CR2, which is obviously a bit of a closer range weapon, and the results do show the same, as this came in with a time of about 20 frames, exactly 1/3 of a second. Lastly, for the Assault class is the EL16 HFE, and surprisingly this came in second slowest of all the Assault weapons with the time of 18 frames, which is kind of strange since it is meant to be a long range weapon, and this kind of explains why I can't aim this thing to save my life. Moving on now to the heavy weapons, and the base weapon surprisingly came in with the fastest time so far at 14 frames. I actually did double check and triple check this because it doesn't really seem right for a heavy blaster, but the results were exactly the same every time. Next up was the DC-15LE, which again did a little better than I expected, coming in at the same time as the base assault weapon with 17 frames. I then tried the FWMB-10K, which is a bit more of a longer range weapon compared to the rest of the heavy weapons, and this came in with a time of 15 frames, exactly a quarter of a second. Lastly, for the heavy class was the TL50, and this was way off the mark compared to the others with a time of 24 frames, which is obviously much slower than the rest, although it is a very close range focused weapon, so that kinda does make sense. Now, moving on to the officer weapons, and the base weapon came in with a time of 17 seconds, exactly the same as the base weapon for the Assault class. I then tried the S5, and this was actually the fastest so far with a time of 13 frames, which again makes sense as it is much better suited to longer range. Next up was the Blurg, which I thought would do about the same, as it did used to be really solid at long range, however it was actually a fair bit less, coming in at 18 frames. With that being said, it is still about the same as most of the assault weapons, so it's definitely not bad either. Now, lastly, for the officer, the dreaded SE44C, which is obviously one of the best close range weapons in the game, but surprisingly, or to be honest, probably not that surprisingly, it came in with one of the best times at 14 frames. Now, moving on to the specialist class, starting off with the base weapon, and this was much quicker than the rest of the weapons with a time of 11 frames. Next up was the IQA11, and this was with no mods, as there is actually a mod that increases the bolt speed, and this came in exactly the same as the base weapon at 11 frames as well. I then tried with that bolt speed mod equipped, which is literally just designed to increase the bolt speed and nothing else, and this made a drastic change, coming in at 7 frames, which is almost a 1/10 of a second, which is definitely pretty crazy. Next up was the A280 CFE, and I thought this might be a little bit slower as it's more of a DMR than a sniper rifle, but it was actually the second fastest overall and technically the fastest without mods with a time of 9 frames. Now, last but definitely not least, we have the NT242, and I thought this would no doubt be the fastest as this thing is obviously very deadly at range, but surprisingly it was actually the slowest of all the snipers with a time of 12 frames. So those are obviously all of the weapons for the regular classes. I would have liked to test all the different base weapons for each faction as there are obviously 6 variants of each base weapon, however that would have been extremely hard to do as I would have had to change the map each time, therefore the distance wouldn't be the same, so that is essentially impossible to do. Technically there are a few ways that I could actually work around that, but it will be a very hard job to do. But if you guys would like to see all of those tested and maybe even all the heroes and reinforcements tested as well, then make sure to leave a comment down below letting me know. So you can see on screen the complete list of these weapons from first to last place, and I've only included the fastest for each weapon if that weapon did have a mod to make it faster. Again, the times are all so similar and it may seem like it's just barely any difference at all, but this does explain why some weapons can be a little bit harder to aim at certain distances than other weapons, as like I said, 1 frame at long distance does actually make a pretty big difference. But that is going to do it for this one, guys. If you did enjoy the video, then make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any more Battlefront 2 videos or live streams. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys have a great day and I'll catch you all in the next one.